talk a lot to my audiences about what I believe to be incontrovertible facts. And I think that the fundamental incontrovertible fact is that life is suffering. And I think that that's why that's a primary axiom of religious belief, in some sense, almost regardless of the faith, that life is suffering. And everyone knows that, although they don't necessarily like to admit it or to talk about it. I mean, you don't have to scrape beneath the surface very far in someone's life to find a tragedy lurking if the person that you're speaking with doesn't have something pretty awful happening to them right at the moment, economically or socially or within their family or physically or mentally. The probability that someone they love has a problem of that sort is extraordinarily high. And if you happen to be among the fortunate minority for whom that isn't true, well, all you have to do is wait, and it will be true soon enough, and sooner than you think, and worse than you imagine. And everyone knows that. And so it's easy to understand why people become cynical and bitter and hurt and nihilistic. Now, I think there's a progression in life. You know, if you're naive, you think that life will be easy and that people are basically good, and then you have some experiences if you're not sheltered too much, and that gets taken away from you because you betray yourself or other people betray you, or you encounter a tragedy, and then your naivety is shattered, and the most likely place that you'll go from there is into something approximating cynicism, because you don't know the alternative, and your initial faith, which was not faith but naivety, is shattered by the terrible reality of what you encounter. And then as a cynical person, you're more wise than you are as a naive person. And then that's a strange thing, because you're worse in some sense than you were. You know, you're not as optimistic, and you're not as filled with hope, and your life is more difficult. And you're probably harder on other people and with more of a tendency towards cruelty. And none of that seems positive, but there's a wisdom in cynicism that the naive lack. But the problem is there that cynicism is not a useful antidote to, let's say, tragedy and malevolence, because there are places that you go past cynicism as you approach wisdom. And it's wisdom that you need in order to fabricate yourself this sort of vessel that will keep you afloat during stormy times. Life is difficult, and it's tainted by malevolence, and it's cast in tragedy. And you need something to offset that, because otherwise it embitters you. And if you're embittered, then you become vengeful and cruel, inevitably. And then you make everything that's made you worse in turn. And there's no bottom to that, you know, as anyone who's even a moderate student of history soon comes to understand. There's an idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and the reason for that is that there's no situation that's so terrible that there isn't some damn fool thing that some idiot can do that will make it far worse. And so the question is, what might constitute an alternative to that? And if there is an alternative, and you know, I learned long while back, reading religious mythology mostly, that there is a difference between thinking and paying attention, and of the two, paying attention is much more important. It's not the same thing as thinking. Like, when you pay attention, you're looking for what you don't know. Like, you kind of detach yourself, and you watch and you listen and you see if things are the way you think they are, and you hope they are, because life is easier if things are the way you think they are. But if you find out that they're not and you're paying attention, then you can weave and you can bob and you can adapt and you can learn. And so you have to learn to pay attention. I just ask people when I'm speaking to pay attention to what they already know. And here's something that everybody knows. You know, in a world that consists of suffering and malevolence, who is it that you admire? Or who is it that you don't admire? Those are the same question, If you know who you don't admire, well, then you have a negative model and you can go for the opposite. And if you know who you admire, well, then you can copy that. And the instinct for admiration is an instinct for imitation. And we're very imitative creatures. And our instinct for admiration is the instinct for imitation. And what would you call it? A deeply biologically and metaphysically rooted guideline to the proper path of life. The question is there a proper path of life? There are certainly pathways that make things worse. That's something to know. You could avoid those. And if there are pathways that make things worse, then there are the opposite pathways, even though those might not be so clear. I think that's why we're often so enamored of evil characters in fictional representations, is because it's clearer. It's easier in some sense to make what constitutes the dark path clearer. It's easier for people to understand, whereas the path that's positive is murkier and more difficult to ascertain. But at the very least, you know it's the opposite of that.